Hello and welcome back to my channel. It's me. In today's video, we're going to meet a man named Junius Spencer Morgan. He was a partner in a dry goods store who grew up to become one of the most respected bankers in the world. But unlike many famous rich people, Junius never went to university. He didn't have any famous parties. And even though he did become very rich, he didn't become famous at all during his lifetime. But what makes Junius interesting is that he was the father of J.P. Morgan, the man who was famous for saving the US economy several times, for breaking up dangerous monopolies, and for funding some of the largest infrastructure projects in the history of the United States. Chapter 1. From Dry Goods to Banking. Junius Spencer Morgan was born in 1813 in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is a town that was built around a canal that was dug through the woods by hand to bring water from a river about 3 miles away. You see, this was the year before the Erie Canal was completed, which would forever change the US economy by providing a cheap way to transport goods across the country. And so, when Junius was born, the small town of Hadley was still just a collection of houses that could only be accessed by walking or horse riding through the woods. Because of this, Junius's father lost his job as a hat maker, because he couldn't get his hats to the market. So when Juniper was just 14 years old, he left school and got a job working in the dry goods business. Now, if you don't know what dry goods are, they are basically any good that isn't perishable. So things like fabric, flour, sugar, rope, cotton, clothing, blankets, etc. Back in the early 1800s, these items were sold by merchants who traveled from house to house. But as cities grew and people started gathering together in places where multiple merchants would be, stores started popping up. So if you wanted to open a dry goods store, you would need to go out and buy the goods. You would then sell those goods to a customer, and then, if they paid you in cash, you would keep whatever profit you made after paying for the goods. But if they couldn't pay you in cash, then you would give them something called store credit, which they could then use to buy goods from your store. If they weren't able to pay you back and they went bankrupt, then you would simply eat the cost. This was how you make money as a dry goods merchant. You could either make money by buying low and selling high, or you could make money by collecting on your accounts receivable when customers didn't have the cash to pay you back. When Juniper was 14 years old, he was hired as a clerk at a dry goods store in Hartford, Connecticut. Here he learned how to manage inventory, sales, collections, and credit. By the time he was 21 years old, he had saved up enough money to buy a share of the company and become a partner. Now, this was great experience for Juniper, because, as he would later write, all business is built on 3 things: credit, credit, and credit. The first thing you want to do when you start in business is get a good name. At the time, the main customers of the store were local factory workers who were given store credit so they could afford basic necessities. However, these customers sometimes defaulted on their debt, which would put the company at risk. Even though Junius was just a junior partner, he wasn't willing to just accept the losses. So instead, he started traveling around to try and collect the money in person. But what he soon realized was that people were less likely to default on their debts when there was a real person standing in front of them. And so Junius decided that instead of letting people charge all of their products, he would require that people pay cash or provide a reference from a local factory foreman that guaranteed that they would pay back the loan. This reduced the amount of bad debt the store took on, increased profits, and gave Junius a reputation for being honest. And so, by the time he was 26 years old, Juniper was ready to start thinking about moving up in life. He wanted to work in banking. But the problem was that he didn't have much education, and banking was usually seen as something that only the wealthy elite could get into. But, as he would later say, "I have been poor, and I know what it is. I have been rich, and I know what that is." But being able to go from rags to riches is the only real success in life. And so, in order to succeed, Juniper knew that he would need to find a rich partner who could get him into the industry. Chapter 2: The Pivotal Partnership with George Peabody. In 1854, at the age of 41, Junius Morgan would meet a man named George Peabody. George was born in 1795 in Massachusetts, and was considered to be one of the wealthiest men in the country. But if you don't recognize that name, it's probably because George chose to live a rather private life and avoid the spotlight. George had built his wealth by starting a bank in London called George Peabody and Company. And throughout his life, he had been incredibly cautious and disciplined, which is how he had grown the bank to be worth $2 million. That's the equivalent of almost $70 million today. What George was really interested in was giving back and trying to improve society. So he decided to seek out a junior partner to run his business, so he could focus on philanthropy full-time. As George interviewed different candidates, he was looking for someone who was smart, disciplined, and most importantly, someone whose morals and ethics aligned with his. When George met Junius, he liked what he saw and offered him a junior partnership in his company. And so, Junius moved his family to London, where he would spend the rest of his life. Right off the bat, George and Junius had a lot of chemistry. They were both frugal and hardworking, and they both believed that honesty and integrity were paramount to doing business. In fact, they agreed that the surest way to make a fortune was to be trustworthy. George explained that if you were honest, everyone you dealt with would want to work with you more than anyone else. George and Junius worked side by side for 10 years, until George retired from the business and handed it over to Junius in 1864. Chapter 3: Taking over a banking empire. When Junius took over the company, it was one of the largest banks in London, with offices in Paris and New York. But the most important thing that came along with the company was the reputation it had built up under George's leadership. You see, for decades, the most trusted name in American banking was the name of Peabody. And because of that, investors around the world trusted Peabody with their money. And so, when George handed the company over to Junius, he knew that he was leaving the company in good hands. Shortly after taking over the company, Junius would leverage the bank's reputation to raise money for the southern states following the Civil War. Junius said, "The South is ruined financially and commercially. Everything is gone. Credit is gone. Banks are gone. Stocks are gone. Bonds are gone. Everything is gone." So Junius would buy bonds for the southern states and sell them to investors in Europe. He would then use that money to lend to railroad companies who were helping to rebuild the South. These types of transactions would eventually make him one of the richest men in America. But the reason why Junius was so successful was that he followed the advice that his mentor had given him all those years ago. Junius understood that the key to making money was to be trustworthy. And so he spent his days meeting with clients and reassuring them that their money was safe with him. And that is exactly what he did for the rest of his life, until he passed away in 1890 at the age of 77. Chapter 4: The Mentorship of his son, J.P. Morgan. From the time that Junius's son, J.P. Morgan, was 2 years old, he knew that his dad was a banker. J.P. Morgan would later say that his father's business was the center of his childhood, and that the sounds of the stock exchange formed part of the background music of his life. J.P. wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and one day take over the family business. And so, at the age of 22, he got a job working in his father's London firm. After working there for 4 years, Junius decided that it was time for his son to come back to the United States and set up shop there. And so, JP Morgan opened up an office in New York and began attracting wealthy socialites who were interested in investing their money. However, he wouldn't have been able to succeed without the help of his father. You see, as I mentioned earlier, Juniper had spent his days building up relationships and reassuring clients that their money was safe with him. And because of that, when JP started reaching out to these same clients, asking them to invest in US railroads, they were happy to oblige. Juniper was even JP's most important client, because when JP started needing more money, he would simply go to his father and ask him to borrow some. Juniper was always willing to lend his son money, because he knew that it was a short-term solution to a long-term problem. For example, when JP lent $7 million to the railroad company Northern Pacific Railway, he didn't expect to ever get paid back. Instead, he bought the stock from the railroad company and held on to it until it appreciated in value, at which point he sold it for a profit. And so this continued until JP became the richest man in the world. Chapter 5. A Quiet but Monumental Legacy. He was the most successful banker in the city, and yet he has never been prominently identified with any great financial deal or with any enterprise outside of banking. Although he was never really in the public eye, Junius was instrumental in helping his son build one of the most powerful banking dynasties in the history of the United States. He showed the world that hard work, discipline, and integrity could go further than money and connections. And these are the qualities that JP Morgan would carry with him for the rest of his life. So, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would really appreciate it if you could hit the like button for me. And if you'd also like to hear more stories about how the modern world came to be, please consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.